Now, our next speaker is an MD and an author, including the most recent book, Women Aren't Supposed to Fly, Memoirs of a Female Flight Surgeon. She's a contributor to Skeptical Inquirer, Skeptic Magazine, and has posted in excess of 600 entries on the Science-Based Medicine blog. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Harriet Hall.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Have you ever noticed that there's a difference between men and women? You may have noticed that men don't like to ask for directions. You may have noticed that women tend to be more emotional than men. My daughters and I have a kind of an ongoing gag that whenever we see a man doing something that we think is foolhardy or silly, we say, "Oh no, testosterone poisoning strikes again." But we really don't know if those things are true. We don't know if it's testosterone poisoning or if it's just the individual weirdness of the person that's doing it. The way to find out is to do science, and science has tried to look at gender differences, but it hasn't done a very good job. There have been a lot of flawed studies that have led to flawed conclusions. When a baby's born, the first thing that anyone wants to know is it a boy or a girl? And that's even before they ask if it's breathing or if it's missing any parts. It seems to be the most important thing to divide babies into these two neat little boxes, boy or girl. And that reminds me of an old joke. The expectant father is in the waiting room, and the obstetrician comes out to give him the news, and he says, "I've got good news and I've got bad news." And the father asks for the good news first. The obstetrician says, "Your wife just gave birth to a 6-pound, 2-ounce eye." And the father says, "Oh my God, if that's the good news, what's the bad news?" And the doctor says, "It's blind." Well, that's a terrible joke, but it makes the point that there are more important things about a baby than whether it's a boy or a girl. Now, children learn to classify everyone as boys or girls very early on. When our older daughter was 3 years old, we heard her talking to herself one day. She said, "Let's see, I'm a girl, and Kimberly's a girl," that was her sister, "and Mommy's a girl, but Daddy's not a girl. He's a boy, 'cause he doesn't know any better." I read a news item online. It said a severely deformed freak was born without a penis. And the father was quoted as saying that not a day goes by that I don't wish my child was born a normal, healthy baby with male genitalia. Well, this was on the website The Onion. And they went on to explain that half the population is born with this particular birth defect. That's meant to be a joke, but in reality, through a lot of history, women were thought to be just a defective man. In Aristotle, he said men had more teeth than women, and it was centuries before anybody bothered to look in mouths because he was the expert. He said women are colder and they're a lower form of life. In procreation, it's the masculine sperm that brings the soul and life to an inert, passive female element. Women only need to eat half as much as men. Women are more void of shame or self-respect. They're more false of speech, more deceptive, and more impulsive. He did have one good thing to say about them. They have better memory. But he thought that women were so inferior that they shouldn't be allowed to leave the female quarters of the house. In the Middle Ages, women were considered the weaker sex. Men were thought to be active and women passive. Women were the root of all evil. And St. Augustine even asked, why was woman even created at all? What do we need women for? And in the Victorian age, men were considered to be more intelligent and better at reasoning. They had greater independence and courage. Women had less energy, and they had to stay home to conserve their energy. Menstruation was thought to be a time of illness, debilitation, and temporary insanity. Women were thought to have little or no sexual appetite, and homosexuality was a crime. It was still a crime in the 20th century, and it's still a crime in some countries today. This is Alan Turing. He was a British mathematical genius. He led the team that cracked the Nazis' Enigma code in World War II, which ended up shortening the war and saving a lot of lives. 5 years after World War II, he was convicted of the crime of homosexuality. He was stripped of his security clearance. He was denied entrance into the United States, and he was offered a choice. He could either have chemical castration or go to jail. He chose chemical castration, and he committed suicide at the age of 42. In 1874, a Harvard professor predicted that women who went to the university would develop monstrous brains, puny bodies, and abnormally weak digestion. And overeducated women would be unfit for motherhood. And these are some beliefs that were present in the 20th century. I heard more than one person say, we couldn't have a woman for a president because she'd be irrational during her periods. Women were not thought to be capable of combat jobs. It's just been very recently that combat jobs in the Army were open to women. And women are thought to be not as capable in math and science. And then there was Freud and penis envy. Freud thought that young girls were traumatized by the discovery that they were missing a part of anatomy. They were incomplete. Here's another take on the penis envy question. The little girl saying to the boy, my mommy says you got one of those and we got brains. Penis envy is better understood today as not an envy of the organ, but an envy of the social advantages of male power. And I can relate to that because I want to be treated the same as a man, but I don't have any particular desire to have those inconvenient anatomical dangly bits. Now, first I need to get straight that people have confused the words sex and gender, and it's considered correct today to talk about sex when we're talking about biological factors, and gender when we're talking about social, cultural, and psychological factors. But there's a problem with that because we don't always know whether something is determined by biology or culture. You may remember this book. It claimed that the genders were so different, it was as if they'd come from different planets. The author said not only do men and women communicate differently, but they think, feel, perceive, react, respond, love, need, and appreciate differently. Well, a lot of what he said is wrong. You see a lot of items in the news about sex and gender. We found the gay gene. There is no gay gene. There was a study recently that said women's brains are different. It was a neuroimaging study done last year. It said that women's brains were wired differently. Women's brains integrated emotion and reason, and men's brains were wired for coordinated action and perception. And there are some problems with this study, and I'll be coming back to it a little bit later on. The sex of a newborn baby is obvious to the doctor at birth, but he might be wrong. Sometimes what looks like a boy turns out to be a girl, and vice versa. There are actually 5 different factors that determine sex, biological sex: the chromosomes, the gonads, the sex hormones, internal reproductive anatomy, and the external genitalia. And for gender, there are factors like the secondary sexual characteristics that we develop at puberty. There's the sex of rearing, whether you were raised as a boy or a girl. There's gender self-identification. There's the object of desire, social gender, and legal gender, and I'm going to be talking about each one of these. The first biological determinant of sex is chromosomal sex. Now, normally, a woman has 2 X's, one inherited from each parent, and the man has an X inherited from his mother and a Y from his father. The diagrams on this slide are not scientifically accurate. We have 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. 22 of them are called somatic chromosomes, and 1 pair is called the sex chromosomes. That's the XX or the XY. And in normal cell division, cells are duplicated exactly with all 23 pairs of each chromosome going to the 2 cells after division. But in the ovaries and testes, instead of the normal process of mitosis, there's a different process called meiosis. And in this process, the members of the pairs separate, and each cell only gets one from each pair. And when an egg and a sperm unite at fertilization, the 23 single chromosomes go back into pairs so that the baby has the full complement of 23 pairs, or a total of 46 chromosomes. But there are a lot of accidents that happen during this process. There are disjunctions where some cells end up with too many chromosomes and some cells end up with too few. In this diagram, there were 4 pairs of chromosomes, and 2 of the cells ended up with 3 chromosomes, and 2 of them ended up with 1 chromosome. And then there are crossovers, where within a pair, the genetic information gets switched from one chromosome to another. There's also additions and deletions, where pieces of one chromosome get stuck onto another, or where a chromosome loses a piece of genetic material. Sometimes a baby ends up with one X and nothing else, and that's called Turner's syndrome. These are girls, but they have poor breast development, and they never menstruate, and they have another number of physical abnormalities. If a man gets 2 X's and a Y, that's called Klinefelter's syndrome. And these are tall men. They have poor beard growth, small testes and small penises, and they have, sometimes they develop breasts, and they have other physical abnormalities. And there's all kinds of other combinations. You can be XYY, XXX, XXXY, XXYY, and probably a lot more. And there's a condition called transposition, where there's no Y chromosome. It's a perfectly normal male without a Y chromosome, but the genes that determine sex have been transferred to the X chromosome, so everything's hunky-dory. Now, have you ever seen a person like this with 2 different eye colors? These are called mosaics. They have 2 different sets of genes in one body. And it's like 2 people in one. And there's also a condition called chimeras, where 2 embryos, fraternal twin embryos, become fused together into one individual. And there was a court case just recently where a woman applied for welfare, and they insisted that her children be tested with a DNA test to prove that they were really her children. And they tested them, and the DNA test says, "These aren't your kids." But she knew they were her kids, so they kept investigating, and they found out that she had had a fraternal twin that got fused with her body early in the process of fetal development, and the parts of her body that had to do with reproduction, the ovaries and the uterus and the cervix, were all from the cell line of her twin. So the newspaper announced it as saying that the woman had a twin, and her twin was the mother of her children. And then there's all kinds of other errors. You may know that Down syndrome is a trisomy of chromosome 13. They end up with 3 copies of that chromosome. The second determinant of biological sex is gonadal sex, and that's complicated too. There can be testes either in the scrotum or hidden in the abdomen. There can be ovaries, there can be both, there can be neither, and there's even a thing called a hermaphrodite ovotestis, which can't quite make up its mind which it wants to be. The third determinant of biological sex is hormones. We generally think of females as having estrogens and males as having testosterones, but that's a gross oversimplification. Sex hormones are really a misnomer, because both males and females produce both androgens and estrogens. And both kinds of hormones are involved in all kinds of other physiologic processes in the body that have nothing to do with sex. And believe it or not, a stallion has a higher level of estrogen than female humans, even when the estrogen levels rise during pregnancy. And some aspects of male typical behavior are triggered by testosterone, but only after it's been converted to estrogen in the brain. Hormones affect the fetus during development. If a girl baby is exposed to too much adrenal hormone, she comes out looking like a boy. If a boy has an insensitivity to androgens, he comes out looking like a girl. And there's this really weird condition called 5-ARD enzyme deficiency, where a boy is born looking like a girl and then changes to a boy at puberty. And that's because he lacks the enzyme that is required in the fetus for the development of the genitals. But there are different enzymes that work at puberty. They're not needed for the process of puberty. In adults, there can be an underproduction or overproduction of sex hormones, and there can be pharmaceutical hormones. For instance, a man who's planning a sex change operation and is taking estrogens. Number 4 is internal genitalia. Women have a uterus, vagina, and fallopian tubes. Males have an epididymis and prostate and other structures. And any of these can be missing or abnormal. Up to 0.5% of women have a double uterus. And there was one case where a woman had fetuses in each uterus, each with a different father, of a different race, and they were born on different dates. Then there's the external genitalia. There can be a normal or abnormal sized penis, a normal or abnormal sized clitoris. There can be ambiguous anatomy, where you can't decide whether what you're looking at is a small penis or a large clitoris. There's hypospadias, where the urethral opening is on the underside of the penile shaft instead of at the tip. There's a concealed penis, where the penis is there, but it's hidden under a fat pad and you can't tell. There's a condition called aphalia, where an otherwise normal XY male is simply missing a penis. And there can be a surgically constructed penis or vagina from sex change operations. And there are other factors that contribute to gender. We develop secondary sexual characteristics at puberty, like breasts and beards. And then there's the sex of rearing, whether you were raised as a boy or a girl. And there was a fascinating case of a boy who was raised as a girl. Little David Reimer lost his penis in a circumcision accident at 8 months. And that just boggles my mind. I can't imagine how such an accident could happen, but it did. And his doctor was a sex expert called Dr. John Money. And he assumed that a boy couldn't be a boy without a penis, so he decided that it would be better to raise him as a girl. So they castrated him. They took off his testicles and his scrotum. They gave him female hormones, and they renamed him Brenda. Well, he never really felt like a girl. He always felt inside like he was really a boy. And when he got to be a teenager, he rebelled. He refused to take the female hormones. He got male hormones and started taking them. And he reassumed the name of David. When he grew up, he married a woman, but he never really adjusted, and he eventually committed suicide. Then there's gender self-identification. You may have heard of gender dysphoria. That's where a person feels like he or she was assigned to the wrong sex. They just never feel like the sex that they were told they were. Then there's the object of desire. People may have sexual desire for males, females, both, neither. They may have fetishes or paraphilias. Now, you've probably heard of shoe fetishes and necrophilia, but have you ever heard of acrotomophilia, the attraction to people with amputations? Have you ever heard of plushophilia, the sexual attraction to stuffed animals? Have you ever heard of formicophilia, the sexual gratification from being crawled on by insects? If you ever want to have some fun, go to Wikipedia and look up the word paraphilias. They have a list of over 100 of them, some of them even weirder than these. Then there's the social role, the clothing, the behavior, and the role that an individual fulfills in society. This includes things like cross-dressing and transgender people. And then there's legal status. When someone undergoes a sex change operation, at some point they can have their sex legally changed. And this makes a difference because men and women are treated differently under the law. For instance, women don't have to register for the draft, and men do. So there are serious consequences to what your legal documents say you are. Is this a he or a she? I can't tell. I once heard a person speak at a conference, and I kept looking at him or her, and I couldn't decide what sex it was. So I used the bathroom test. I saw the speaker go into the ladies' room, and that answered my question. So sex and gender are complicated, and I've lost track of who said this, but it expresses it perfectly. We are driven to categorize, but nature is endlessly inventive and is indifferent to our taxonomies. Gender role in psychological sex may have nothing to do with physical and biological aspects. And sex, gender, and sexuality are not either-or dichotomies. They're a multidimensional spectrum on various axes, biological, social, psychological. Even the axes are problematic because science hasn't conclusively shown which traits are biologically determined. And there's the nature versus nurture debate, and nature and nurture interact. And sometimes it's hard to tell how much is attributable to one and how much is attributable to another. And the spectrum has degrees on each axis. So you might be strongly masculine on one axis and strongly feminine on another axis. Science started to study gender differences in the 20th century, and it really started with the Kinsey Reports. They were published as a book called The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948 and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. Kinsey found that men and women were more alike than he'd previously thought, and he found that both men's and women's sexuality was shaped by social and cultural forces. He also found that there was a spectrum of sexuality. Some people were exclusively heterosexual. Some were predominantly heterosexual with varying degrees of homosexuality. Some were equally heterosexual and homosexual or bisexual. Some were predominantly homosexual but with various degrees of heterosexuality. Some were exclusively homosexual, and some were asexual. They just had no interest in sex at all. And he found that about 10% of American males were homosexuals. But he also found that 47% of them had reacted to both sexes at some time during their life, and 37% of them had had at least one homosexual experience. Then Masters and Johnson got into the act. They actually brought couples into the lab and had them have sexual intercourse with cameras and all kinds of instruments wired up to them, and they learned a lot. They showed that vaginal and clitoral orgasms were the same. They found that vaginal lubrication did not originate from the cervix, as had previously been thought, and they showed that some women were multi-orgasmic, and that caused a big stir. They published two books, in 1966, Human Sexual Response, and in 1970, Human Sexual Inadequacy. And they also prompted a popular cable TV show that you may have seen. Now, the Kinsey poll showed 10% of American men were gay. Masters and Johnson found 5%. But these were both by polls, by the self-reports of people that they questioned. And it seems that more than a quarter of people hide their sexuality from anonymous surveys. And maybe a tenth of gay men are still in the closet. So there are other ways of looking at the question. They looked at porn searches, and they found that 5% of the porn searches online are for depictions of gay men. And they compared Google searches for "is my husband gay" to "is my husband cheating?" And they found that "is my husband gay" was 10% more common. This guy told us that there wasn't a single homosexual in Iran. And I think we can be pretty certain that his estimate's wrong. So I would guess that it's more like something in the 5 to 10% range. So all these gender differences have been reported, but we want to know which of them are real. And if they're real, which of them are determined by our genes and built into us, innate things that can't be changed? And which of them are culturally determined and might be amenable to change? Well, the author of this book said that men and women have such different communication skills that they might as well be speaking different languages. So science looked at communication. Do women talk more than men? Well, they found out no. They both average about 16,000 words a day. Do women disclose more about themselves? Well, yes, but only slightly more. Do men interrupt more often? Yes, they do, but only slightly more. And when women are in charge, they interrupt more than men. These are the human universals that have been found in every single society that's ever been studied, past or present. Every society has had a division of labor by sex. Females do more direct child care. The husband's generally older than the wife. Males and females are seen as having different natures. Males dominate in the public and political realm. Males engage in more coalitional violence. They're more aggressive. They're more prone to lethal violence. They're more prone to theft. On the average, they travel greater differences over their lifetime. A mother normally has a consort during the child-rearing years. And there are sex differences in spatial cognition and balance. And in every society, sex or gender terminology is fundamentally binary. This was taken from a book called Human Universals by a man named Donald Brown. There are a whole long list of them, but these are the ones that related to sex and gender. But this is the way it is. It's not necessarily the way it ought to be or the way it has to be. And these are descriptive, not prescriptive terms, and they don't tell us whether these traits are innate or whether they're cultural. And it's quite possible that there's some evolutionary advantage to these traits that makes it better for societies to teach these traits to the people in the society. Pink is for girls, right? Well, evolutionary psychologists speculated that since pink and red are in the same spectrum, a preference for red might have evolved because it improved the success of gatherers in hunter-gatherer societies, and women were usually the gatherers. But it doesn't seem to me that preferring a color would mean that you're necessarily better at detecting it. And, the berries turn red when they're ripe, but not all berries. What about blackberries and blueberries? So it didn't really make sense to me. And it really turned out to be just a very silly just so story, since girls don't actually prefer pink. It's a cultural thing. In the Victorian era and as long as late as 1918, pink was for boys and blue was for girls. And they've studied 4 to 5 month-old babies and found that there's no gender difference in color preference at that age. And studies of adult females have shown that they actually tend to prefer blue. Carol Tavris wrote a wonderful book called The Mismeasure of Woman, where she explained why scientific studies of gender differences are suspect. In the first place, normal was always defined by the men. Studies of gender differences are contaminated by male bias, and she thinks the real differences are not due to gender, but they're due to power, resources, and life experiences. We know that self-perceptions are culturally determined. There are stereotypes that girls are worse at math and that Asians are better at math. So they studied a group of Asian American women. And when they reminded these women of their gender before a math test, their scores dropped. When they reminded them of their race before the test, their scores rose. Cordelia Fine wrote a book called Delusions of Gender. The subtitle was How Our Minds, Society, and Neurosexism Create Differences. She says, pick a gender difference, any difference. Now watch very closely as, poof, it's gone. A study shows something, and then a better, larger follow-up study is done, and it shows exactly the opposite. They repeat a study with slightly modified conditions, and that often reverses the findings. And gender differences can be erased sometimes by offering a financial reward for good performance. Now, are these differences real? Are women more empathetic? Well, if you do a questionnaire, yes, they answer like more empathetic on the questionnaires, but if you look at their behavior, there's really no difference. Do babies prefer female faces? Well, yes. unless they spend most of their time with male caregivers, and in that case, they prefer male faces. Do men do better on Mendel rotation tests? Well, yes, but when women were told that women do better on this test, probably for genetic reasons, their performance on the test equaled that of men. And do men do better on math tests? Usually, but if you tell women ahead of time that studies have shown that there's something innate about the female brain that makes females better at math, they do better at the math tests than the boys do. They've done cross-cultural studies showing that the math gap, the gender gap in math, varies from culture to culture depending on cultural factors. So it's not an innate inborn ability. Now, researchers make assumptions. They've classified fantasies about marriage as a feminine trait, but they've classified a positive orientation towards marriage and parenthood as a masculine trait. And I wonder just how different are those, and how do you define it? How do you know? And they've generally classified behaviors like initiating sex, expressing physical desire, masturbating as masculine traits, and they don't allow for the concept of autonomous female sexuality. Today's idea that men have a stronger sex drive than women is the exact reverse of the ideas in Renaissance Europe. Back then, they thought that women were sexually insatiable, and that men's rationality enabled them to better control their base desires. And today, if we see a man who's very concerned with his dress and his behavior, and his dress and his appearance, we think that he's likely to be gay. But in early modern Europe, such a man was thought to be a womanizer, a Don Juan, a sort of a hyper-masculine male. They've studied aggression. Aggression is hard to define and measure. If you think women aren't aggressive, think of Maggie Thatcher in the Falklands, or think of a mother bear defending her cubs. Some studies have shown that girls are just as aggressive as boys, but perhaps in different ways. They show their aggression differently. And we think of testosterone as causing aggressive behavior, but in studies, only about half of them found a correlation between testosterone levels and aggression. So one way researchers have tried to solve the conflict between heredity and environment is to look for differences in toy preference in young children before the cultural conditioning has had a chance to kick in. But these studies have generally been poorly designed, and they've been contaminated by assumptions that the researchers make. In different studies, balls are categorized as a boy toy or as a gender-neutral toy. Lincoln Logs were classified as a boy toy, but they had to change that category to neutral because the girls were spending more time playing with the Lincoln Logs than with dolls. And they did a study of one-year-old children, gave them a choice between a ball, a car, or a doll, and there was no difference between what girls chose and boys chose. And the same behaviors have been categorized as male or female behaviors when the observers knew the sex of the child they were observing. Rebecca Jordan Young wrote a book called Brainstorm: The Flaws in the Science of Sex Differences. She analyzed over 300 studies, and she said the closer she looked, the less it made sense. She found all kinds of unquestioned assumptions about what hormones do. She found that a lot of the studies were very small studies on just a few individuals, and they'd never been replicated. She found studies with conflicting results. And she found that the choice of what to study and how to measure it reflected the bias of the researchers, who were usually men. And ideas about male and female behavior have changed as societal norms changed, but the researchers didn't even seem to notice. They kept doing things the same way. I mentioned a neuroimaging study earlier that said that women's brains are different. They said that women's brains had more left-right wiring and men had more front-back connections. Well, we don't really know what that means. We don't know what those nerve connections are doing, so we really can't say much about it. And it was interesting that the differences were small up until puberty, and then they became larger. So what does that mean? Does it mean that there's something about hormones that changes the structure of the brain? Or does it mean that cultural conditioning waits till puberty to really reach its full effect? You know, brain imaging is a blunt instrument. It measures things indirectly. You can't measure thoughts, you can't measure what individual neurons are doing, but you can measure the blood flow or glucose levels in different parts of the brains. And the results of the studies are reported as group averages. Let's say they find that, let's say emotion is found in one part of the brain. Well, it may be that there were individuals in that study that had emotion showing up in a spot over here or over there or somewhere else, and they've averaged them all together and they've pinpointed this one spot, and it may not be the whole story. And there's no way to correlate the size of a brain structure with its psychological function. Spurious findings are common. This was an MRI study, functional MRI study that they did on a salmon. They asked the salmon to look at a picture, and they found that those little red dots were spots in the salmon's brain that lit up. And they might have concluded that that was the part of the salmon's brain that processed vision, but it wasn't, because this was a dead salmon that they bought at the supermarket. And they did this study just to point out how easy it is to see something on an MRI and have it not really be real. Male brains are 8 to 10% larger than female brains. But so what? Brain size does not correlate with intelligence. It might just be a function of body size. If men are 10% bigger, their brains are 10% bigger. Just as with penises, brain size doesn't matter. They did studies of language lateralization that showed that there was a difference in the hemispheres where language is processed between men and women. But they were only small studies, and when they put them all together into a large meta-analysis, or when they looked at a large study with large numbers of people, it showed no difference between the sexes. There have been studies that have showed that the size of the corpus callosum and the percentage of gray matter are greater in women or in men, but the direction of the difference of the differences is opposite from one study to another, so it probably doesn't mean anything. And differences like these often disappear if you correct for brain volume. So are these traits innate or induced? Well, if it was an induced trait, a learned trait, where else but in the brain would you see the effects of socialization or experience? There's neuroplasticity. We know that brains change over time. And all kinds of things act on the brain. Hormones act on the brain, and the brain acts on hormones. Genes switch on and off in response to our thinking, our behavior, in response to what other genes are doing, and in response to our environment. There have been some outrageous claims made. One educator used to speak to audiences and tell them, girls see the details and boys see the big picture because the crocus is 4 times larger in girls. There's no such thing as the crocus. I have no idea where you dreamed that up. Now, we do know that there's a gender imbalance in careers. Women are underrepresented in science, math, and engineering. Is this because they have some innate difference in ability? Is it because they have some innate preferences? Or is it because of cultural influences and stereotypes? Well, this graph gives us a clue. This shows the percentage of women and men in medical school from 1961 to 2009. And you can see that as social attitudes changed, the number of women rose until it's about 50-50 now. But that may not even be enough. In Norway, 70% of doctors are women, and they're still complaining about unequal treatment, unfair treatment. Maybe there's something about women that makes them better suited to be doctors. So maybe 70% isn't enough. How could we know? Well, it's important to remember that gender differences are differences between the averages of the groups. And there are greater differences within the groups than between the groups. Group differences don't define individuals. And as a group, men are stronger than women, but some women are stronger than some men, and some men are weaker than some women. So there's no reason to assume that an equal percentage of men and women should be attracted to every field of human endeavor. What we can do is try to level the playing field so that men and women are equally free to choose any occupation. And when that happens, it may be that some men will gravitate more to one occupation and some more women will gravitate to another. And that's okay. We ought to just let things fall where they may. And we can do some things to compensate for biological differences. We can offer daycare and maternity leave and facilitate breastfeeding and things like that. And a lot of the legal barriers are gone. Fields that women were not allowed to go into in the past, they're allowed to go into today. But even so, the stereotypes persist, and they're going to be a lot harder to get rid of than the legal barriers. And changing stereotypes is going to require long-term cultural change. It's going to require changes in the schools and changes in the media, and it's going to require role models and maybe some affirmative action for occupations that are dominated by men. People have tried to eliminate the influence of cultural conditioning by gender-neutral parenting, but that simply doesn't work. For one thing, no matter what they tell the kids, parents still have the underlying implicit associations and stereotypes that they were brought up with. And children are very good at picking up on body language and tone, and they may realize that the parents' body language doesn't really correspond with what the parents are saying. For instance, if parents tell boys it's all right to play with dolls, they might get the message that the parents would really be happier if they didn't. And when children become socialized, when they start playing with other children and meeting people outside their family, they adopt the attitudes that are prevalent in society. And there's a lot of peer pressure to assume stereotype gender. And young children become gender detectives at a very early age, and they become gender police. Now, I read in one of those books, I read a funny story about a little boy who came to preschool wearing barrettes in his hair. Another little boy challenged him, and he said, "You can't wear those, only girls wear barrettes." And the little boy says, "Well, anybody can wear barrettes. I'm a boy and I'm wearing them. That proves that boys can wear barrettes." And they argued back and forth. And finally, the little boy pulled his pants down and showed the other little boy his penis and said, "See, I'm a boy and I'm wearing barrettes, and that proves that boys can wear barrettes." And the other little boy said, "That doesn't prove anything. Everybody has a penis, but only girls can wear barrettes." He was a little confused. Now, Sweden is in the midst of an interesting experiment right now. They have a minister for gender equality. They're aiming for 50% representation of women in parliament, and they're up to 45% already. The major newspapers in Sweden have started using a gender-neutral pronoun in place of the he and she pronouns. They have affirmative action programs for occupations like firefighters, and they have gender-neutral preschools. One couple even refused to divulge the sex of their newborn baby to their friends and family. But they're starting to see a backlash already. And men are saying, "Hey, now you're discriminating against men. This isn't equality, this is erasure." They're complaining that the media are dominated by feminists and there's no room for even moderate dissent. And feminists are starting to get hate mail. They interviewed a boy who was taking ballet lessons, and they told him that in other countries he'd be teased and hassled by the other boys. And he said, "I know, but this is Sweden." So it's going to be interesting to see how this experiment plays out. It's fascinating. The Washington State Community and Technical College system has 500,000 students in 34 institutions, and they've just made some changes on their registration forms to ask questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. These are the choices for sexual orientation: bisexual, gay, lesbian, queer, straight/heterosexual, or prefer not to answer. For gender identity, they have the choice of feminine, masculine, androgynous, gender-neutral, transgender, other, or prefer not to answer. The answers are confidential, but they're intended to get the colleges to start thinking about the needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students, and hopefully to eventually increase the diversity of their enrollments. Now, scientists have gone too far. They have overinterpreted questionable and conflicting data to argue for biological differences that may not be real. And feminists have sometimes gone too far in the other direction and denied that there are any differences at all. And it's just as foolish to deny innate differences as to attribute everything to them. Now, we know that there are some biological differences. Normal lab values for hemoglobin are lower in women. The incidence of different medical and psychological disorders varies by sex. Males are more prone to things like autism, dyslexia, Tourette's, heart attacks. Females are more prone to things like depression, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and Alzheimer's. And knowing about these medical differences is very helpful to doctors in making diagnoses and deciding on treatment. But we're not so sure about other kinds of gender differences. So to conclude, the science of gender differences is a blooming, buzzing confusion. We know there are differences, but we haven't been able to pin them down very precisely yet. Group differences don't apply to individuals, and differences really don't matter much for most practical purposes. A quote from Jordan Young's book, she said, "Gender is just not a very useful way to group people's predispositions." And with that, I'll end.